Welcome back to the History Fix. Today we're going to talk about the transition from antiquity to feudalism, which is one of the big problems in world history. And in fact, it's a bit of a misleading idea because the implication is that there's a huge shift as we move from the ancient world to the medieval world. And I think really that idea goes right back to the 19th century when a lot of scholars had the idea that when you compared the ancient world with the medieval world, the ancient world represented some kind of peak of civilization, after which you had a relative decline, and then things didn't really begin to pick up again until the Renaissance, with the Renaissance period's rediscovery of the grandeur that was Greece and Rome. And really, I think if we look closely at that dichotomy between ancient and medieval, it begins to dissolve, even though, incidentally, 19th century figures like Karl Marx and Fred Engels were also very committed to this idea. They talked very clearly about a difference between an ancient world that they imagined to be based on slavery and a medieval world they imagined to be based on serfdom. I think if you really look at what is going on between the emergence of the first class societies based on an essentially agricultural economy, and that's beginning to happen as long ago as 3000 BC, if you remember, in some parts of the world. You look at what's happening from then right through until the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and the 19th century, the reality is both simpler at one level and, in another way, more complex than that traditional 19th century view. It's simpler in this sense. What's really going on throughout this huge swathe of human history is that surpluses of wealth are being extracted from agricultural producers in order to provide the resources for creating civilization, creating empires, all of those resources that get ploughed into the building of cities, the building of fortifications, the maintenance of armies, the construction of palaces, great art, great churches, great mosques, all of these things that we associate with civilization in the ancient and the medieval world. The resources for that are really coming from one form or another of the exploitation of ordinary agricultural producers out in the countryside. This is an essentially different variance of an agricultural economy. It's pretty simple in that sense. No hard and fast distinction between the ancient world and the medieval world. On the other hand, it's more complex in the sense that when we get down to the detail, when we drill down and we look at individual societies, we find we've got a huge variety of different ways in which those societies are organized in practice. Sometimes the producers are predominantly slaves. Sometimes they are serfs. Sometimes they are tenant farmers. Sometimes they are free peasants. Different ways in which people are categorized, classified, controlled, defined legally, and so on in these different kinds of agricultural society. And the way in which the surplus is extracted varies as well. Sometimes it takes the form of labor service, where the entire produce of the worker's labor, if he or she is a slave, is taken by the master, or a proportion of it, if he or she is a serf. Other times it's taken in the form of rent, and rent can be paid sometimes in kind, that is in produce, or sometimes in money. It can take the form of tax payments. It can take the form of tribute payments, of tithes paid to the church. And not least, it can often take the form of interest payments to creditors when small farmers get into difficulty, get into debt, and have to pay over large parts of what they produce in the form of interest payments on their accumulated debts. All of these are different ways in which surplus is being accumulated by different types of elite from the labour of ordinary people out in the countryside. And then those elites, they can be diverse as well. Emperors, kings, princes, dukes, warlords, feudal potentates, Roman tax collectors, landlords in control of slaves, in control of serfs, in control of tenant farmers, in control of sharecroppers, and so on. A wide range of different types of ruling class busily extracting surplus. Let me take two concrete examples. Let me compare the situation in the late Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. And as far as we can judge, looking at the Roman source material, it seems that a very high proportion, if not an actual majority, of the people working in the countryside were officially classified as what the Romans called coloni, which we might translate as serfs. That is, people who were tied to a particular estate and were obliged to work for the owner of that estate, sharing with the owner of the estate a very large part of what they actually produced. So that's part of the way the late Roman system worked. But what was also happening is that those same coloni, those same serfs, as well as paying rent to their landlord or contributing labour service to their landlord on the landlord's land, they were also having to pay taxes, tribute to the Roman emperor to sustain the Roman state, to sustain the Roman army. That's one example, one practical example. Here's another. Come forward 500, 600 years to Norman England in the 11th century. What's the system there? Well, again, the agricultural producers are predominantly serfs called villeins. In other words, they're people who are tied to a particular village, a particular estate, and they are handing over a large part of their produce, or they're working on the Lord's estate for free, the Lord's domain for free. And who is their Lord? He is a Norman, he's an invader, he's somebody who's recently come into control of the land, and he is defined first and foremost by the fact that he is a soldier with an obligation to do military service to his higher lord in the feudal hierarchy. Now, these are different. There are important differences between these two examples that I've chosen, more or less at random, but the basics are the same throughout. A ruling class in control of land, in control of the people who work on the land, extracting surplus from them and using that surplus for the various objectives which they have as emperors, as kings, as landowners, as feudal warriors, and so on. Now, I'm skating over the differences in this episode of the History Fix, and I don't want to overstate the case and imply that it's not meaningful to talk about a kind of society where we apply the very specific label feudalism. And what I plan to do next time on the History Fix is to talk in much more detail about what we mean by feudalism. It's essentially a military system, not a fundamentally different system from the Roman system, but different enough to deserve special treatment, and we'll be focusing on it next time. That's all from the History Fix this time round. We are facing the greatest crisis in the history of humanity. Capitalism is driving us towards climate catastrophe. To understand how we got here and how we get out of it, we really need to understand human history. What we're trying to do here at the History Fix is to give us the understanding of the past that we need to equip us to fight for a better future. If you like what we're doing, please share and subscribe. and also contribute to our Patreon page. Thanks very much.